Okay, we're picking up where we left off in the previous video, and so now these are actually kind of pretty good general settings, but there's a couple more things we can kind of do to fine-tune things. But before we do that, I want to kind of show you guys really quickly the tune material. So Brazil has something called the tune material, and we'll find it in Brazil Render Shortcuts Material Editor. And you can kind of pull these down a little bit. You'll probably have a couple basic materials. These are ways to create your own basic materials. This is a basic Rhino, actually Rhino default template. But we want to create actually a Brazil material because basically most of the renders have their own specific materials. And so if you click on here, the plus mark here, you'll be able to create a new material. And you'll see a lot of the Brazil materials listed. The one we are looking for is this one, the Brazil tune material right there. Say OK. And it comes out as like this blue neon, bluish pukey color. So what you want to do is go down a little bit here under the parameters and change this gooch to background, and go down even more to the ink parameters, and in this sort of min part you can put in something like 0.5. The general range for this is 0.2 roughly to 0.5, and this actually is the parameter that controls the thickness of the ink width or the line width basically, right? So once that's done, it should you don't really have to save anything, but just say OK or turn it off, and go to the Brazil settings here, and if you can find it, I can always pull it back up again, and the last section, render pass control. So this is a way to actually enable pass control. This is a way to actually apply a global override to all the materials in your scene, which is often used to, for example, sometimes people just need what is called in the production environment a clay render, basically a white render with shadows, for example. And sometimes they use it or compositing sort of purposes. Sometimes they use it to basically mock up scenes. And so here, the global material replacement use custom material, and down here under the specified material, it's empty, so you click here or here, you click to assign. And instead of clicking any of these materials, you just pick the Brazil tune material you had earlier. And you can double click or say, OK, I'll just double click. And this basically applies this Brazil tune material that you just created to everything in the scene. And let's render that really quick and see. All right. So what this gives you is basically a line drawing of your geometry, and it's generally pretty good at figuring out intersection geometries and things like that. We'll kind of get a better, sort of more clear example as we sort of move along, but this is the way actually to create a Brazil tune material that gives you this. And the sort of neat thing is that then you can actually just export this and overlay this in Photoshop as the sort of outer framework for your line drawings. All right. So that's the tune material and the sort of render pass control, or sometimes we call it that, or sometimes we call it basically the global material override. And you can set the sort of environment here as well. So if I didn't want that, that was kind of like a, well, this is already a white. We were using a white background in the first place, so that probably doesn't really make a huge difference. But let's say I wanted to do this in gray instead, then this is where you would kind of specify that, right, in the background override. So these all kind of like work off of the same ideas. So for the next step, let's actually disable that, and we are going to actually make a new environment. Now, I'm not actually going to access it from here. You can find a Brazil menu, render shortcuts, environment editor, right there. Okay, So remember, this was the white basic one that we had earlier, and to make a new one, you click on the plus sign. And in this case, and there's a couple other ones, but the one we want here is the Brazil physical sky environment, right? And at the same time, you want to basically double click on it to make it active, and you'll see the sort of yellow brackets shift over to the Brazil sky environment. So now it's the active environment, and let's render that. Oh, so you see this is sort of a really blue thing. Now the thing about the physical sky that's nice is that you can actually link it to the sun system within Rhino and use that to kind of get both a sort of more realistic, I wouldn't say realistic, but more like atmospheric rendering, not the sort of abstract white and gray rendering type. So this is the basic sort of output that you got at first. This means that we actually need to kind of change some of the sun settings. Okay, so under, I actually don't, okay, it does work. Under Brazil, render shortcuts, you can get to here, which is the show sun settings. So under here, and I'll sort of leave this here on the side. Under here, you can basically turn the sun on, and you'll see that actually in the scene, it updates. So the scene and direction of the sun and everything has changed, because if you kind of look at this closely, basically you can specify dates, time, sun positions, geographical location right here. So for some reason I'm in Ghana right now. So you can actually dial in, right, or find by latitude, longitude, where it is, time zone, or basically these sort of geographical locations, right? So you can dial that in, and this would be basically a really realistic sun setting parameter, right? And that's Rhino's sun system. But with that on, if I render it again, you'll see that basically I'm getting that. Okay. However, there is another level of settings here that is associated with Brazil's sun, or Brazil's specific sun setting. So there's Brazil sun settings. This is the Rhino sun setting, which basically just governs the position, the control, or the sort of latitude, longitudinal model of where the sun position is. For Brazil itself, it has these, and so you can, in this case, let's turn the shadow on. And when you do that, you'll actually find that you get, you know, some shadow settings that you can sort of play with if you want, but I'm just going to say, okay, let's see what we get. All right, so now we're getting shadows here now, right? Okay. But okay, and let's say, you know, okay, these shadows are a little bit dark, so let's go back to the settings, and you can turn something called attenuation on, which is basically the sort of idea that, you know, shadows aren't completely dark; they get a lot of scattered, bounced sunlight into them. And let's clone that, render, just to see the difference. That looks pretty close. And also, one of the other things you might want to change is actually in the settings, you can change whether or not you want to use the sun color. If you don't use the sun color, which is sort of generated or determined by the physical sun model, then actually that will turn the renderings. It will basically use, at least in this case, I think the sort of basic white sun color. So it's sort of depending on what sort of style you're really going for, whether or not you want to use the sun color or not. It's probably a little less evident, at least in the sort of physical sky versions. But these are some of the basic settings for the physical sky. Now, one thing that I do like about using this is if you go to the Rhino Sun options and toggle the manual control, so you'll see that all this stuff disappears. Toggle the manual control, and if I'm looking at my viewport, I can actually just dynamically use this to control where my shadows are. So I can change it, to kind of face this direction. I can change the azimuth of the altitude of the shadow, so I can control this a bit more intuitively and directly without having to worry, really where the sun is in relationship to my project. And in some cases, this is really helpful, especially for interior views, where you can get kind of fine-tuned to get like the sort of more dramatic shadow effects that you were looking for. So for the last couple of examples, we're going to go back and go here under the Environments tab and choose, instead of physical sky, go to Use Global Current, Edit, and let's see. Okay, so do that. So if we go back to the Environment tab and change this back to the basic environment, go from the Brazil physical sky back to the basic environment here, and you'll see, if you try to render that, you'll see that things get completely overblown. The lighting solution is blowing out the scene, and this is a situation where, because we both have both like the physical sun, or the sort of sun on here, and your global illumination on as well. And so you actually have to kind of mess with the settings a little bit and basically bring both down to an acceptable level. So the way to do that is actually go to, first of all, so basically there's the two places where you can sort of change things. One is here in the Luma server, under the sort of skylight multiplier, use and run this multiplier. Let's change that to 0.5 for now. And then go back to your Brazil for Rhino settings, Brazil for Rhino Sun settings, and here in the multiplier for the sun color, use 0.5 as well. Say OK. All right, that looks a lot more legible, right? So, but now it's starting to kind of get a little bit too gray, right? And so this is just showing you the two places, and generally, basically, what you want to do, and this is a little bit off color. One of the things you can do is actually not use the sun color. You can uncheck it, or you can even specify a color of your own. But be careful with this. Usually the sun colors want to be pretty subtle, because if you apply any color like this, it'll turn your scene purple. So that's basically like the sort of emitter color that they use to specify the sun. So unless you want to do something that's really disco, yeah, stay away. So generally this is like either white or whatever that sort of basic generic colors, or sometimes just a tint yellow, a very, very slight tint of yellow. So to kind of get more basic, more abstract control, I usually just leave this as white if you kind of want. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to mess between this setting here, the Skylight Global GI Environment Multiplier, and this setting here, right? Just to kind of see the difference. All right. So for first one, I'm actually going to bump this up to 0.7. In the sun settings, say OK and render that. So that gives you a sort of slightly brighter scene. and it's getting closer to the sort of original abstract rendering colors that we were looking for. Okay, I'm gonna clone that. And then let's go back to here and push this down to 0.5 again. Say okay. Now this time I'm going to push the skylight GI up to 0.7 and render that. And I'm just doing a comparison so you can kind of see what the difference really is in between using these two settings in particular. So this is the first one, this is the second one. The first one basically relies more on the sun itself, right? And so depending on the angle of your sun, you'll have parts where okay, the shadows here are darker, but then you have parts where, you know, the sort of faces of your geometry are less noticeable, right? They're a little bit more uniform and washed out. But when you use this setting, which is kind of like a more overall lighting, then you get basically lighter shadows, but a bit more generally uniform diffuse lighting. And I mean, this is really scene and view dependent, right? So I won't say that, but if you kind of look at it, basically in the case of the cube, you kind of, in some ways, you'll sort of read it a little bit better, but you know, that's something that basically you can sort of adjust, right? So, but the good rule of thumb is to think about these two roughly. I mean, you can play with it, but roughly like this multiplier plus this multiplier wants to be somewhere around 1.2 or 1.3, right? And if you go too overboard, then you'll blow your scene out. But these are the two settings that you can kind of adjust in tandem to kind of get a good balance for your scene. All right. Let's see. So I'm going to leave it at 0.7 here. I tend to like the more uniform overall lighting. And now I'm going to turn actually these things off. The render cache, the regather, and the photon map under the Luma server, all these off. And if you render it, you'll see that basically it'll take a little longer, right? But it's sort of, this takes the longest, but it's the highest quality. And at the same time, because it's not using these sort of approximation algorithms, it has a tendency to be a little brighter than what you saw earlier when you have these options on. So kind of keep that in mind, that if you're kind of using these shortcut options to help you develop your scene, you can actually have these or kind of fine tune the settings so they're a slight, tiny little bit darker than you want. So then that when you disable them, they'll you can kind of basically normalize or basically sort of predict, right, the effect that turning these settings off will have. But what you'll see is that, you know, basically you'll get a much sort of smoother gradient, you know, in the sort of shadows, and this is probably still, you know, a little tiny bit overbright for my for our purposes. So I don't know, let's do 0.65. And yeah, this is sort of like the broader, I would say the broader sort of production setting. Sometimes that I will use for my own renders. But one of the sort of characteristics really in terms of working with Brazil is that I will tend to blow out the scenes, but then overlay the toon shader line work back in Photoshop, and it will actually create a pretty nice effect. And that's something we'll show you guys how to do a little later on. And in this case, you know, if I'm sort of starting to find that the background disappearing, then, you know, basically what you would want to do is sort of go into, and let me just cancel that, is to actually go into here and mess with these settings, like maybe turn the attenuation off, or you can actually play with how the shadows work, and potentially just make the sun a tiny little bit stronger etc., etc. There's a lot of sort of settings to play with here, but I think these are the basic ones that you kind of want to mess around with. And so working between these two, usually you can find a pretty good balance. And I'll just wait for this rendering to finish. And while that's running, you know, there's a couple PDFs that we will sort of be hosting on the site. This sort of Brazil render sequence PDF that I just showed you is basically these sort of sequential images of the steps that we just took in these last two videos, except this time it has basically, you know, basic information about what settings I changed as we went along, right? So you can sort of use this in tandem with the videos to kind of let you know. And this sort of screen grab showing you where some of the settings are. Some of these might have changed between the versions, but you know, they give you a pretty good idea where to find a lot of the commands or a lot of the menu items that we're looking for here. As well as, you know, where the save frames are, where the sort of manual control for the sun settings are. You can also find them in the basic Rhino options as well. The ground plane settings, which have changed a little bit, making basic materials, making the tune material. Right, so this is the Brazil sort of settings screen caps. All right, so all this material will be online. There's a little bit of adjusting to do, but you know, these are, you know, nice basic settings. And these are higher quality, so they'll take a little bit more time for you to run, right? I guess the sort of last sort of thing to remember or to know is that actually once you've dialed in a lot of these settings, if you save your file, your Rhino file, your Brazil settings will be saved, right? So it might actually, for you guys, it's a good idea to actually maybe just kind of create a setting files like this or a dummy file like this, and basically just keep on using this file. If you've kind of tweaked the settings to, you know, what you like, basically just save this file, and in the future what you can do is just basically import your geometry into this file for rendering. Another way of doing this is actually basically saving these Brazil settings, these render settings here. You can click save, and these are sort of Brazil presets. And so you can say, you know, Brazil, the presets, or the, yeah, presets, like that. And the same thing, like save it on your desktop, save it on your Dropbox, save it on your USB drive. And even when you get to a new computer, you can do this and just load, find those presets and load them in. The one caveat is that this only saves the Brazil settings. It doesn't save the Rhino Sun settings. These are just shortcuts, right? But actually these sun settings, these are within the Rhino options. So, you know, you'll have to kind of remember that these settings aren't saved with this. And so it's up to you. This is a little bit more portable. This kind of gives you the sort of added hassle of like having to import geometry and sort of mess with that. But both have their, I would say that both have their advantages, disadvantages. But you know, this is, just remember that, you know, the sun, in particular the sun settings, aren't really portable in the same way. Okay. And yeah, basically that concludes the sort of basics of Brazil render settings. And they're, as you can see, they're not too complicated as long as you know what to look for. There's a lot of other stuff you can mess with, but these are the basic essentials for you to survive. In the next videos, we'll actually start getting into more complicated stuff, really, with the application of textures. That is a whole nother territory within both either Brazil or just rendering in general, right? Okay, just really quickly before I forget, and I'll just sort of splice this in, is that we have also a file, a sort of shortcut file. That's the Brazil render dialog, and it's basically a sort of stitched together Photoshop version of the Brazil settings with every panel expanded and some very basic generic description of like what things do. But basically, we're actually just going to call out the ones that are more relevant or the ones that you're more likely to use. You probably don't really care about this, but this is probably somewhat important. If you check it, then that basically forces Brazil to run in the background and frees up some CPU cycles to kind of let you do other stuff. So basically, your computer won't act like it's completely frozen as it's rendering. This usually is on output resolution, and these are actually the same things I go over in the video, but they're kind of helpful just as a reference, so you can kind of look back at these and say, I kind of write what some of the higher lower qualities of these settings are, etc., and some of these things that I actually didn't really cover, but I think they're a little less important. So these are go into a lot more detail, but for the most part, for Brazil, if you're doing abstract renders, a lot of these are not too necessary. Things like this, for like reusing lighting solutions, are kind of more for animations than they are for stills. So yeah, this is a kind of good thing to look at really quickly or use as a reference. All right.